Welcome to True Crime and Coke. I am your host, Eve, and this podcast is about true crime, disappearances, conspiracies, hauntings, and anything strange or unusual, all while drinking an excessive amount of Diet Coke. If you have a story to share, I would love to hear and feature it on a future episode. Just email me at truecrimeandcoke@gmail.com and put which category it is in the subject line. If you enjoy this podcast and want it to continue, please rate me 5 stars, tell your friends about me, and consider supporting me on Patreon under True Crime and Coke. Now that that's out of the way, let's begin. Hi, this is Eve. Welcome to my 7th episode. Today's episode is going to be about Winston Moseley. The case is better known as the Kitty Genovese case. And more importantly, it's about 38 people who could have stopped the crime, but did not. So let's get started. It was March 27th, 1964. For more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens, New York, watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. The killer had 3 chances to kill this woman. He was interrupted 2 times, but the 3rd time when he came back, he finished the job. If only 35 minutes prior, one of these 38 law-abiding citizens would have called the police would have come and probably saved this poor woman. Let's talk about the victim. Her name was Catherine Susan Genovese. She was born July 7th, 1935. She was commonly known as Kitty Genovese. She was born in New York City and was the daughter of Rachel and Vincent Andronell Genovese. She was the oldest of 5 children in a middle-class Italian family and was raised in Brooklyn. After her mother witnessed a murder in the city, the family chose to move to Connecticut in 1954. Genovese, 19 at the time and a recent graduate of Prospect Heights High School in Brooklyn, chose to remain in the city where she had lived for 9 years. At the time of her death, she was working as a bar manager at Evie's 11th Hour Sports Bar on Jamaica Avenue in Hollis, Queens. What wasn't revealed until 40 years later was that she shared a Queens apartment with her girlfriend, Mary Ann Zelanko. Kitty Genovese was a lesbian. On March 27, 1964, approximately 3:20 a.m., 28-year-old Kitty was on her way home from her job as a manager of a bar. She parked her red Fiat in a lot adjacent to the Kew Gardens Long Island Railroad station. It was a lot that faced where she lived, and many of the residents would park their cars there, so I'm sure parking was very hard to find, so that's just where they parked. She turned off the lights of her car, locked the door, and started to walk the 100 feet to the entrance of her apartment at 8270 Austin Street. It was a Tudor-style building, and it had stores on the first floor with apartments on the second. The entrance to the apartment is in the rear of the building because the front is rented to retail stores. Even though the retail stores were underneath the apartments, at nighttime there was not good lighting, so it was very dark. Kitty noticed a man at the far end of the lot near a 7-story apartment house at 8240 Austin Street. She stopped, but then she nervously headed up Austin Street towards Lefferts Boulevard, where there is a call box to the 102nd Police Precinct in nearby Richmond Hill. She got as far as a streetlight in front of a bookstore before the man grabbed her. She screamed, and lights went on in the 10-story apartment house at 8267 Austin Street, which faces the bookstore. Kitty screamed, "Oh my God, he stabbed me. Please help me. Please help me." And from one of the upper windows in the apartment house, a man called down, "Let that girl alone." The assailant looked up at him, shrugged, and walked down Austin Street toward a white sedan parked a short distance away, and Kitty struggled to her feet. The lights went back out, and the killer returned to Kitty, who was now trying to make her way around the side of the building by the parking lot to get to her apartment. The assailant stabbed her again. "I'm dying," she shrieked. "I'm dying." Windows were opened again, and lights went on in many apartments. The assailant got into his car and drove away. Kitty staggered to her feet. A city bus passed by. It was 3:35 a.m. By now, Kitty had crawled to the back of the building where she was inside her apartment house doors, where she thought she was safe. But the assailant returned. He tried the first door, but she wasn't there. He went to a second door at 8262 Austin Street, where he saw her slumped on the floor at the foot of the stairs. He stabbed her a third time. This time, it was fatal. It was 3:50 a.m. by the time the police received their first call from a man who was a neighbor of Kitty. In 2 minutes, they were at the scene. The neighbor, a 70-year-old woman, and another woman were the only persons on the street. Nobody else came forward. The man explained that he had called the police after much deliberation. He had phoned a friend in Nassau County for advice, and then he had crossed the roof of the building to the apartment of the elderly woman to get her to make the call. "I didn't want to get involved," he told police. There was a housewife who casually said, "We thought it was a lover's quarrel." A husband and wife both said, "Frankly, we were afraid." They seemed aware of the fact that events might have been different. A distraught woman wiping her hands in her apron said, "I didn't want my husband to get involved." One couple that night said they heard the first screams. The husband looked at the bookstore where the killer first grabbed Kitty. He said they went to the window to see what was happening, but the light from their bedroom made it difficult to see the street. And the wife added, "I put out the light and we were able to see better." The police asked why they didn't call, and she shrugged, "I don't know." A man peeked out from a slight opening in the doorway to his apartment and rattled off an account of the killer's second attack. Why hadn't he called the police at the time? His response, "I was tired," he said without emotion. "I went back to bed." It was 4:25 a.m. when the ambulance arrived to take the body of Kitty. It drove off. Then, that's when the people came out. The police stressed how simple it would have been to have gotten in touch with them. "A phone call," said one of the detectives, "would have done it. The police may be reached by dialing 0. And it only took them, 2 minutes to get there when the call was actually placed. So if the person who saw the first attack called, or even the second person, they would have arrived and probably saved her." 6 days later, a man was arrested in connection to some burglaries. And when he was arrested, he confessed not only to the murder of Kitty Genovese, but to 2 other murders, both involving sexual assaults. Who was this man? He was Winston Mosley, an African-American business machine operator. He was a 29-year-old married father. He was born in Manhattan on March 2nd, 1935, and grew up in a troubled home. His first marriage to Pauline Cisco, with whom he had the 2 children with, ended in divorce. In 1961, he married Elizabeth Grant, who was a nurse, and they had a child. And what's weird is he had never been convicted of a crime before. So here's what I think happened. I think he probably has always had these urges and was unable to do them. But his new wife worked as a nurse on the night shifts, so it gave him the freedom to go on secretive crime sprees. He burglarized homes, and he preyed on women in the early hours while his wife was at work. So I think opportunity alone was what brought out his inner killer. So, when Mosley gave the confession to the police, he detailed the attack, which corroborated the physical evidence at the scene. And his motive for the attack was simply to kill a woman. And this is what he said about that night. He said he had been prowling in his car for 90 minutes looking for a victim, spotted her, parked, and began to trail her on foot. But that's when she ran, but he attacked, and he jabbed her in the back. He said she cried, "Oh my God, he stabbed me, help me," and that he heard a neighbor say, "Let that girl alone." So he hurried back to his car, parking it farther from view, but he then returned to find Kitty lying near the back of her building. He said he came back because I knew I did not finish what I set out to do. He said he stabbed her several more times, then raped her and stole her money. And while she died of her wounds, he went off to his day job like nothing. When confessing to Kitty's murder, the other two women he confessed to murdering were Barbara Kralik, aged 15, and Annie Mae Johnson, aged 24. But despite Mosley giving a detailed confession of raping and killing these additional women, the police took no formal statements and never tried him for these other two murders. Barbara Kralik was stabbed in her home on July 20th, 1963, and Mosley's second victim was housewife Anna Johnson. She was shot and then burned to death on February 29th. This was 2 weeks before the Kitty Genovese attack. On June 11th, 1964, Mosley was convicted of first-degree murder in the Kitty Genovese case. 4 days later, announcement of his death sentence was greeted by applause from courtroom spectators. But why wasn't he tried for the other two killings he confessed to? Well, I have to kind of go off the story to tell you, so we're going to go off on a little side note. So as it turns out, months earlier, a white teenager named Alan Mitchell had confessed to murdering Kralik. The 18-year-old Mitchell had been interrogated by police 7 times over 50 hours, after which he signed a confession that was written by detectives. Yes, written by the detectives, not himself. While in police custody, Mitchell claimed he was threatened and physically abused. He quickly recanted the confession. So Mitchell, not Mosley, was tried on the murder of Barbara Kralik. Mosley, he even served as a defense witness. Not only did he confess to killing Kralik, but he provided a step-by-step account of the murder, including the detail that a small serrated steak knife was used as the murder weapon. This was a detail that had not been made public. So Mitchell's trial ended in a hung jury, but he was convicted during a second trial when Mosley served as a witness but refused to talk that time. Mitchell served 12 years and 8 months before being released. He was tracked down eventually and asked why he confessed to the crime. And his reply was simple: "I would have confessed to killing the president because them people had me scared to death." But you also have to remember, at that time, false confessions were unheard of. They thought there would be no way anyone would confess to something if they didn't do it. But now it is common knowledge that there are a lot of people who have falsely confessed due to either being too tired, not smart enough, not proper defense, brutality, all kinds of things. One example being Brendan Dassey. So back then, that was not the normal, but now we know that it's common. And I do wonder how many people are in prison for false confessions. As far as what happened with the Barbara Kralik and Annie Mae Johnson murders, I don't know. I'm sure if I did more research, I could find something, but believe it or not, even though we are talking about Winston Mosley's murders, the main story is not about the murders. We have not gotten there yet, so let's get back to the story. So, what happened to Winston Mosley? Well, his death sentence was later altered to life imprisonment, and in 1968, Mosley stuck a Spam tin can into his rectum, and he hoped that the injuries would force him to be transferred from his cell in Attica prison to a hospital, which it did. Well, on the way there, he escaped from the transport van and broke into an empty house in Buffalo, New York. After 3 days of watching TV and eating canned food, he called a local employment office and asked them to send a maid. When she arrived, he threatened her with a gun he'd found in the house. Then he raped her, warning that if she told anyone, he'd find and kill her children. The maid left a confused message for the house's owners. When they arrived, Mosley tied up the husband and raped the wife. Later, the district attorney filed charges against the cleaning woman for failing to report her rapist to the police. After a standoff in downtown Buffalo, Mosley was arrested again and returned to jail. While in jail, he was able to get a degree in sociology, and he died at the age of 81 on March 28th, 2016. He was one of the longest serving prisoners. So the main part of the story is actually the aftermath of Kitty Genovese's murder. On March 27, 1964, the New York Times ran an article titled 37 Who Saw Murder Didn't Call the Police, and it was alleging that multiple neighbors heard or witnessed Genovese's murder but did nothing to help her. The report was prompted by a conversation between Times editor A.M. Rosenthal and Police Commissioner Michael Murphy, during which Murphy made the claim that was the basis for the article. The newspaper followed up the next day with an analysis speaking to several experts on the psychology of why people would choose not to get involved. Later in the year, Rosenthal adapted this information into a book called 38 Witnesses, the Kitty Genovese Case. The New York Times was criticized for not having factual information on the case and also criticized for trying to use it to make headlines. Her case sparked the bystander effect, or also the Genovese syndrome, which attempts to explain why someone witnessing a crime would not help the victim. Psychologists Bibb Latane and John Darley made their careers studying the bystander effect and have shown in clinical experiments that witnesses are less likely to help a victim if there are other witnesses. The more witnesses, the less likely any one person will intervene. The reasons include the fact that onlookers see that others are not helping either, that onlookers believe others will know better how to help, and that onlookers feel uncertain about helping while others are watching. The Kitty Genovese case thus became a classic feature of social psychology textbooks. In September 2007, the American Psychologist published an examination of the factual basis of coverage of the Kitty Genovese murder in psychology textbooks. The three authors concluded that the story is more parable than fact, largely because of inaccurate newspaper coverage at the time of the incident. According to the authors, despite the absence of evidence, the story continues to inhabit our introductory social psychology textbooks, and thus the minds of future social psychologists. One interpretation of the parable is that the drama and ease of teaching the exaggerated story makes it easier for professors to capture attention of the students and their interest. In 2015, Genovese's younger brother Bill produced and narrated the documentary The Witness, in which lays out the case against the Times, reporting in strong terms. Only 2 neighbors have been shown to behave at the time of the murder in the way the Times claimed 38 people did. One of those was Carl Ross. Intoxicated that night, Ross heard noises and after deliberation cracked open his door to investigate. He saw Kitty laying on the ground, still alive and attempting to speak, and Mosley stabbing her. He shut the door and called a friend to ask what to do. The friend said not to get involved. Ross eventually climbed out of his window and went to a neighbor's apartment. He called the police after hearing Sophie Farrar call for someone to do so. Ross's explanation was, "I didn't want to get involved," became the famous rejoinder of the bystander effect. The murder of Kitty Genovese is also credited as one of the factors that pushed the emergency 911 system into place after New York City officials joined in a national effort involving officials in other cities. It became the national emergency number in 1968. So, what really happened to Kitty Genovese that night? Well, reassessments of what had happened concluded that there had been 2 attacks, not 3, and that there were far fewer witnesses, and what they had heard or seen and how they had perceived it was not as portrayed. Some neighbors assumed that Genovese's pleas were from a drunken argument outside the neighborhood bar, which was a common occurrence. The police were in fact called, and someone went out to hold the victim in her arms. Kitty brothers Bills come to the realization that the whole truth about Kitty's death will never be known. And he thinks that's maybe why the story continues to fascinate people. And one thing I will say is in the very beginning, how I mentioned that Kitty was a lesbian. Well, supposedly her girlfriend Marianne was the woman who found her and held her in her arms until the ambulance came. However, they were very homophobic back then, and they did not want to state that in the police report or in the newspapers. So hopefully she did die in the arms of someone she loved. That is the end of this short episode. I guess what you can draw from it is that don't assume that someone else is calling the police when you see something. If you see something, call. So, yeah. Anyway, also, don't believe everything you read in newspapers or hear on the news. Have a good evening.